Hey everyone, this is Mike Dunn, and you are listening to the second episode of Rethinking EDU. Woo! So we're here in the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. We've all been doing sort of this online learning thing for about a month now, and I'm here with four of my teaching friends, as usual, my co-hosts. Matt Downing. Want to say what's up, Matt?
Hey everyone, how's everyone doing? I'm excited for episode number 2.
Yeah. And Julie Cook.
Hello, it's Julie, looking for some semblance of life before COVID-19.
Nice. And Janine Dunn.
Hey everybody, it's Janine, and I'm in isolation here with 9 members of my family, so we're trying to social distance as best we can.
Oh my gosh, 9 members. You mentioned that last episode, and I can't even imagine. So we've all been on lockdown in our homes here, as I mentioned, for about a month now. But before that, and even right now, all 4 of us are students in a doctoral program at Northeastern University. That's how we met. And we got to talking in some of our classes about education, and we decided what better way to share some of the things that we really love to talk about than through a podcast. And so here we are. I hope you listened to our first episode. We focused on kind of the things that are happening in education right now as a result of the pandemic. And this second episode here is going to be focusing on distance learning. And if you're like most of us, we've had to quickly pivot into this world of the unknown when it comes to distance learning. And none of the 4 of us are homeschool teachers, and none of the 4 of us are primarily online instructors. And so this has been a huge shift for us, and it has certainly been a huge shift for many of our teaching colleagues that we've talked to. We want to kick off tonight just hearing from our panel friends here. What are some of the biggest challenges that are going on right now? And I know maybe Matt and Janine, you guys want to talk about some of the challenges you've been experiencing?
Yeah, I can start off. There's definitely been a ton of challenges, as we all have experienced. I mean, we can just take one simple tool like Zoom, right? And that presents a lot of challenges even within itself. So take Zoom, right? We want to use it. We know we can interact with students in a distance learning capacity, but how do we know the students are even able to download the software? So the school district I'm in, we have 14,000 students, and we started using Zoom, and we got call after call after call. Even though the software is simple, you're going to have some issues with different devices and different capabilities for people to get on. And then when you get onto Zoom, how are you going to conduct a class, right? We're all sort of been trained in classroom management, but we haven't been trained in Zoom management. So what are we going to do when we have all these kids on here? How are we going to conduct a lesson? Is live lesson even the way to go? Is that even productive? Should we just have these flipped learning mini lessons recorded so the student can stop and pause? And it's really brought a lot of good questions, I think, to the forefront, through the lens of some of those challenges. So those are just a couple of examples that I've experienced.
Yeah, I would say that some of the teachers, their skill levels have, you have the student skill levels, you have the teacher skill levels and what they're capable of doing. I know in our school, we certainly have a wide range of teachers, young teachers to older teachers, and trying to get them all on board to be able to understand how to use it. And just like you said, with, managing a classroom in a building is one thing, but managing a classroom online is completely something else.
And Janine and Matt, give us some sense. So Matt said 14,000. Janine, how large is your school?
My school's pretty small. We're a K-8 school, and we have about close to 300 students and probably 30 to 40 staff members. So I can only imagine what Matt is going through with having to work with 14,000 students and families. We've had our own, and we don't have a tech department per se. We have a team of teachers that volunteers to do our tech sort of stuff. I help out with that team. So and considering that I had the most experience with using Zoom, I ended up being tapped into creating our own, tutorials for our staff and trying to get them up and running with it. So it's been challenging. And like Matt had pointed out, right? Like if people are accessing the online software here from different devices, whether it's an iPad, a phone, a computer, tablets, there's just like slight nuances for how to use each of those. So it's not even like you can give out like blanket directions. You kind of have to know what they're working with.
Yeah, exactly. And we even have, the privacy issues with Zoom, right? The thing on the news now is these Zoom bombings, like people figuring out these
Yikes.
links and they're
It's
going
crazy.
in. Have you guys heard about all of that going on?
Yeah.
In
Yeah,
education?
yeah.
So,
Like even the New York City school teachers had to be
Yes.
like, now no longer to use Zoom, right?
yeah, exactly.
Right.
So you even have that,
And now Zoom's coming out with update after update after update. So I felt like last week I had already trained teachers on like the new updates that had just came out. And now there was another one that was released this weekend. So I'm like, oh man, I gotta go and check that out again to see if there's anything else that I got to update the teachers on, because things are constantly changing. And Matt also brought up a good point with the security issues. Like things are happening so lightning fast, and we're just rolling out with things, and then we're kind of like learning in the moment, like, oh no, right, there's Zoom bombers, or there's should students be allowed to have their cameras on? Does a parent need to be present while a student is in a session because there's a camera there? Should we be worried about recording sessions that students are in and then being able to post that later? Like there's so many questions that are being raised now.
Yeah, we just went to our schools asking us to record every single session we have with students, no matter what. And then we have to upload them all into our Google Drive to share them in case any sort of security issues occur. And even when security issues don't occur. It's wild. Matt, you talked just for a second before Janine was talking about helping train her staff. What's been your role in helping train your staff at your school? Because that's your primary role, is trying to work with staff to do this sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And my ears kind of perked up when Janine said that, because it's difficult. Like when you're working with staff, right? You want to help them, you want to support them, but you can't teach to the lowest denominator, right? We don't want to bring our professional development or our training or our helping down to the extreme basics. Because what about the teachers that do want to experiment? They do want to grow. They do want to do things that other teachers aren't able to do. So that is what I find the challenge, right? Because I also can't help 1,000 teachers individually, but I want to push them to grow. So one thing I've done is I've created these screencasts, just simple screencast, and I create some that are a little bit more advanced, and then I'll create middle range, and then I'll have like basics, and then I've even created this new sort of form, bringing it titled Back to the Basics, because I find some teachers just get overwhelmed and they need help just getting back to the basics, and then other teachers want to run and do crazy stuff with video, and I want to be able to help all of those different teachers. And that's hard, just like it is in a classroom, right? We don't want to dumb everything down to the student that's struggling the most. We want to be able to push people and tailor things to their gifts. And the same thing I'm finding with helping them. But sometimes, to be honest, you got to tell some teachers to put on the brakes, because as I think we're going to talk about throughout this episode, there's so much new stuff, and I can't help with all the new toys out there, because that's impossible for me to get an understanding. So I've had to say that a couple of times. I've had to say, look, I'm not an expert. I don't really know that tool. Why don't we put that on pause, and why don't you use something that you are familiar with or that I'm familiar with, and then we can engage in learning that way. And that's been also helpful.
So Matt, you just mentioned a little bit about the like volume of free or new stuff being put out there. And I was just in a conversation with some colleagues of mine and I about streamlining virtual college access today. And we are running into the same sort of issue, that there are all of these platforms out there, and they're useful when you're talking about on a classroom by classroom basis. But it's really challenging when schools are having to roll out huge technology initiatives at the whole school level, all without being able to do like in-person training on new technologies, and I think of like some of my if I was in high school, or when I was in high school, my teachers varied in age and skill level, quite a bit. I had some teachers that were maybe like 24, 25, and some teachers that were 65. And I can only imagine what kinds of challenges that something like this would present to.
Mhm.
I had one teacher who was a math teacher who didn't really love to use technology at the time. So they would just handwrite on line paper all of their tests, and then they would photocopy their tests, and we would take them. Like, how are we supporting those teachers that are maybe like moonlighting in their careers, or have been doing this for a while otherwise, and this is so new that it's like, they're automatically in their panic zone. Like, how are we helping teachers in that way?
It's tough. And the first thing is I'm very sympathetic to those teachers in those positions. They didn't know this was coming. They weren't really preparing for this, and it's not their fault either, right? That's not their strong suit. They've been in this teaching industry for years upon years and have so much skill, and maybe this isn't one of the things they're best at. So
Right.
I'm very
Right.
sympathetic, and I've created basic tutorials for these teachers. I've had phone calls with with some of these teachers and had Google Meet sessions, and just to sort of calm them down. I think sometimes I've gone into classrooms and sometimes they just need to be told it's okay. We'll get through this. Like, let's figure out the basics. What are some ways that you have connected with students in the past in your classroom, and how can we do that in a simple way digitally? And let's just think of 3 ways, and I'll help you through this. And we're going to just work on one today, and next week we'll work on another, and we'll just keep working. But we're going to keep it simple. We're going to keep it basic, and we're going to keep coming back to the expertise that they do have, because they have a ton of expertise. And how can we just transfer some of that to the digital realm, because it will make a big difference. And that's just how I've tried to approach it. I think it's been helpful.
If you ever wonder why Matt Downing was a teacher, that statement right there captures it, right?
Exactly. I think we all want him on our team.
Yeah, that's right, Julie. What about you guys, Janine? Do you tend to have any like older teachers or folks that aren't so keen to jump on the tech bandwagon?
Yeah, I gotta say, well, first of all, I gotta say our staff is amazing. They've all been, no matter what age they're at or where they're at in their career, they have jumped on and are giving it their best shot. I think a lot of them have taken their lead from the students, because the students have also demonstrated just how resilient they are, and just, yeah, sure, they've gone with the flow and are taking on things. But yeah, we actually have our physical education teacher is close to 70. And
That's awesome.
she's been in all my Zoom sessions and asking questions, and she's given it her best shot. So I think teachers really have demonstrated that they are some superheroes right now, taking on all this new stuff. I think their goal, I think Matt's right, like, keep it simple. If we can keep it simple and focus on what are we doing here, why are we actually doing this anyway, I really think that it's because we're trying to create a sense of normalcy for the kids' sake. So going through all this rigmarole to try and learn new technology, again, what is it? What do we need to focus on? We need to focus on the kids, the students, and that's why we're doing this. I think that we go back to, okay, you have the teachers that are learning these new things, but the students are also learning these new things, and they all have different ability levels as well. They have different access to technology. So that also puts a big, it's a block, like a roadblock can be there because of that. And then you start thinking about the parents and, what they're able to do too. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges that are involved with this transition to distant learning. I think it's important that we take it, we slow down. And like Matt said, we keep it simple, and we keep the eye on, we're doing this for the students.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that there are just so many digital solutions right now that are being presented to us, and that one thing we just can't do, even though we're thinking we can do, is recreating the actual physical school experience. And
Yes.
I know, Julie, this is something that you and I had talked about in the past. I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, educators to the rescue across the country. I've been honestly impressed by companies, educational companies, universities, libraries, networks, you name it, other schools. Just it's been, open throughout the educational community, which, is phenomenal if you think about it. I don't think I've ever seen such generosity among educators before, really. But there is, as we said, I think last week, this fire hose, even well-meaning organizations, who take the time to even curate them all for us. It's still a lot to go through. There are some great resources out there. I think it's really been challenging, as Mike said, I think a few minutes ago, about, we can't recreate a physical school. So trying to just do school the way we had it a month ago, just isn't going to work. So look through the resources we can do, and can access, making sure that, we're in line with, our philosophy of education, that it's pedagogically sound, that it's for our kids. All of those are big decisions that, we've had to make over the past 3-4 weeks here, and trying to be very deliberate about that.
Yeah, I think that there's something you're saying here about asking teachers and schools to start to really think about what is essential, like what is really actually necessary in this situation. Because I think that schools do a lot of things that maybe aren't that essential. And I'm sure we all can think of things at our schools that happen that we're like, really? Okay, we're doing this because we're doing this, but do we really need to be doing this? And I think that that's a really important question that we should be asking everybody. And
Yeah.
and I think that your point is spot on, Julie, that as much as we try, we're not going to be able to replace physical school right now. We might be able to replace physical school in the future, but not right at this moment, right? Because right at this moment we're in like pivot, panic, pandemic mode. The three P's
That's right.
of our situation. We can coin that in the subtitle of this podcast episode. But I think we talked about this a little bit, but I think we can't hit on it enough in last episode and this episode, that this situation is also as much about equity as it is about anything else, right? That our problems with equity are really raising their horns in this moment. And one thing we didn't talk about last episode, but is interesting in this one, is about assessment, equitable assessment, right? So right now there are like droves of colleges that are replacing their testing requirements for next fall's admission. And Tulane University just went test optional for 1 year today. In the past week or so, there have maybe been 30 to 40 colleges that have all said, yeah, we've been thinking about going test optional in the past few years, but now we're really going to do it. Hamilton College, for example, they've been thinking about going test optional for a while. They went full test optional just this week. So there's lots of these schools that are rethinking assessments. I put it out there to all you. Maybe we start with Matt. You've been on the tech end of this. How are we grappling with assessment in this situation?
Mike, when you say test optional, what do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. So, if you apply to a university, typically they're going to be looking at your grades, GPA, whatnot, how you did in your challenging classes in high school, and then your SAT, ACT, AC, or SAT2, maybe your AP tests, anything in that realm. What schools are doing, like many schools across the country for the last 50 years, have been rethinking whether a standardized test like the SAT or the ACT is even required. And in the past, I would say 25 years in particular, the number of schools that are saying we don't really care that much about standardized tests has been growing pretty exponentially. But in the past 3 weeks, that number is growing even further. and you see some of the most selective colleges in the country right now saying, yeah, we're not going to do testing requirements for maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 1 year, and then we're going to revisit it. My thought is that it's very unlikely that any of those colleges will require testing ever again. But that also leads to, yeah, right. It's going to totally topple the testing industrial complex, number one. And number two, it's going to totally topple, large scale assessment. At one point, the conspiracy theorist in my brain was saying that the SAT, the College Board who proctors the SAT, is attempting to create the SAT as the ultimate exam that a student would take as a junior or senior to graduate from high school. And then they're working on designing exams for every single grade below that. So to pass every grade, sort of like the New York Regents exams, you'd have to pass through a College Board made SAT-like exam for every single grade, which we see, I'm sure we all see in some of our schools, whether they're called the Park exams or the Terra Nova or the P, whatever is, there's zillions of tests out there. But that whole complex, if we start with standardized tests for college, is going to start to kind of unravel really quickly, in my view. If we're really talking about rethinking education, I think this is one of the ways that's going to cause us to rethink what we're doing. But I want to bring that back down to the classroom level, and if anybody wants to jump in here about what this is causing us to have to do with assessment at the classroom level.
Yeah, I can jump in, Mike, there. I think, first of all, I forgot to celebrate that there aren't any PSSAs. But yeah, so
the Pennsylvania State exams, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. So I think, if the governor of Pennsylvania this year said, we're only going to do, what is most essential, and that was, the first thing to go, that begs the question, what is that test for? Accountability, very important. I think it'll just reframe the conversation as we go forward. How do we use that test? So
or do we use the test, right?
Right, or what other kinds of assessments could be used. And I think at the classroom level, I've had a lot of meetings over the past month. In the past week, I've had 3 hours or so of meetings, and they've been about assessments. And really looking at, how do we grade? Schools going to pass fail. We have schools getting rid of letter grades or percentage grades and going to proficient or excelling, or, what does it mean? We've been trying to be very deliberate about what we roll out now, realizing that, today in our state, the governor just declared, no more school for the rest of the year. So that's official.
Yeah, crazy.
And I know I read an article today thinking about, what if this comes back, in September? So whatever decisions we make, these conversations actually have been pretty helpful for rethinking perhaps grading and evaluation, and how can we in this environment give good feedback? What does an 84% really mean? Do we care, if your mom helped you? Do we care if you don't have a parent who can help you? All of those questions are pretty important lately.
Well, and then you've also raised the question, like, how do you monitor taking an assessment online, which I'm sure there's answers to that. I know we tested something out last week we use GoGuardian, so we can see our students' computers and what's on their screens, and we can close out tabs, so we could certainly monitor them while they're taking a test that way online. But I don't know if that's the best situation to be taking a test in.
Right. Yeah, I can think of a number of students that would just be disastrous. Also, it feels like very Orwellian, right?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not going to let you open up a new tab, right?
I can tell you, I didn't like it. It felt weird. I don't know. It just wasn't right. But at the same time, it's like, okay, if they're going to take a math test, and then a lot of schools maybe don't have online programs. That maybe they were using just textbooks for whatever subject. And, so then what? Do you scan the test in and send it to them, or do you mail it to them and have them mail it back? Like, I don't know. How does that all work? Seems to get it gets very complicated after that. So I don't know. The assessment piece. I think there's going to be a lot of conversations around that.
Matt, from a tech perspective, you got anything to add? All of our listeners would love a true in-depth analysis right now.
Yeah. I don't know. It's been interesting for me to look at a traditional district and how they view assessments, right? They're big in, end of the marking period assessment, mid marking period assessments. They have all these assessments. And then they have state assessments. They have millions of assessments. And so their initial approach is, we are going to keep doing assessments. And it's been really interesting to watch, because they can't keep doing the way they've been doing with school, shifting, right? So, okay, so how do you plan on doing that assessment? And now we're seeing these traditional schools have to backtrack. And it really brings us to, rethinking assessments in education. Like, project-based learning can still thrive in an environment like we're in today, because it deals with real skills, right? That the students producing beyond something they're filling out on a piece of paper, and we have to monitor them and make sure there's no cheating, make sure, everyone is doing it by the book. It's just really interesting. And I've saw that in my district, and Philadelphia just made an announcement today. They're going to start doing some sort of assessments in May. I'm like, okay, what's that going to look like?
Yikes. Yeah.
And from a tech perspective, I mean, my mind's just spinning, and I'm just observing and trying to figure out the pieces that are able to be played, and what really shows, learning, and how can I use technology to do that?
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. And you guys have heard me say this before, but I think if we could solve two major problems in education with a magic wand, what I would love those two problems to be would be funding, which I'm sure we'll talk about in some episode later on. Education funding is a hot mess. We all know that to be true. But the second major problem I said was assessment, that right now schools tend to be hung up on things like the PSSAs or the Parks or the Terra Novas or like whatever they are, these big standardized assessments that involve you potentially filling out bubbles and submitting them to some unknown source. And then the unknown source takes 2 months to grade them and tells you that you magically passed by some standard that they have said is appropriate, right? And it's totally inauthentic. As adults, we know that we don't have to take tests like that ever. Well, maybe not ever, but very rarely, right? And yeah, I can't even say maybe graduate school exam, but even then, yeah, driving exams, yeah. But it just isn't. It isn't common. It isn't a thing, and yet we still continue to use them in education and we think that that's a good idea for some reason. But I think one of the areas that this is causing us to do right now, which in my view is fantastic, is to say that's just not going to work. How do you possibly administer PSSA exams to 14,000 students while they're at home, who may or may not have access to technology, whose older brother or sister or cousin might be at home with them with their 3 dogs, and mom is having to work from home, and people are sleeping in the living room, and there's no quiet space, and there's really, really bad internet. I just don't see how that's possible. It requires us to rethink that situation.
Well, and it's forcing the conversation, so if we're moving away from percentage grades, are we moving toward competency-based education? What kind of feedback would be helpful for students, for parents, for teachers? And how will this change the conversation about what assessment as a forward-looking instrument to inform our instruction really, how is that going to change this conversation? I think that's where we're in the beginning stages of those conversations, and they're happening across the country, which is actually a little exciting.
Yes, 100% to that. And I think that leads us to talk we've been dooming and glooming here for a little while. And I think we got to talk about some of the positives that are coming out of this. We've talked a little bit about testing and how we're having to reevaluate our evaluations. What are some other things that you all think that are opportunities that are arising out of this situation?
I think real world connections, I already have seen, even with my own kids, that with being at home, learning at home, and doing something different, they've done things that they probably would not have done if they were at school, you know? Like my daughter, she's in sixth grade. She had an assignment to go find signs of spring, you know? We just moved, we have a pond out in the back, and there she was collecting frogs and frog eggs, and we're looking things up to find out, is it a toad, is it a frog, how do you tell the difference, you know? Like, and it was, that in itself was such a learning experience, and then she was able to share that with her class, you know? um, so that was kind of cool. I just think that there's other opportunities here for, like, all right, there's like real world stuff that we can actually do that kids can learn things that are applicable. Like I'm putting together a scavenger hunt right now for our kids for, like, all right, let's learn some like home ownership 101. I'm going to send you on a throughout your house, you know, go find where the water main is, you know, how do you turn it off? Ask your parent, you know.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, like those sort of things. So I think that there's going to be different lessons than what they would be in the classroom, you know.
Well, and to jump on that, I think about the format of a lesson or a unit, as I think Matt said in the very beginning here. Like, are we going to package lessons up, record ourselves talking, and then the child accesses that at some point during his or her day? Or is it a live session? There's some sort of mini lesson, and the child then heads out into the world to go ahead and learn, so what is a flipped classroom, and how much time do we spend talking, at students? I know, in our school, we spend a lot of time thinking about, student-driven learning as opposed to teacher-centered learning. But this is a great opportunity to kind of turn that on its head again and say, what really are we doing here? And how can we continue to make this student-driven learning? All these other questions that come into play too. Families have always played a role. It's just a really big role right now. I think about that. I think about, as I said before, the open source that's happened across the country, and it's really been all hands on deck. As a person who works in a charter school, it's been great to see that schools have really cooperated, kind of realizing we're all living in the same moment together, and how can we push through and share as much as possible. So there's a ton of conversations in education that are happening right now because of this disaster.
Just to piggyback on those things, the student as the creator, and technology really provides an avenue to that. We think of simple things like recording the voice and recording video, right? Those are so easy now with our technology, with our phone, and with a simple Chromebook. And we can have students not only writing. I love writing. I think it's a great skill. It's a great tool. But for some students, it's not always helpful in them displaying their understanding or explaining something or producing something, right? They can say something, or they can record a little video, or they can make a podcast like we're doing. And that excites me, because those are simple technologies that students are able to engage with, create cool stuff that engages with what they want to do, even a blog. So these are things that I've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest opportunities at the moment is the ability to personalize learning for students. We can actually ask them, what do you want to learn? We don't have to take the state PSAs right now, the state tests. So what are you interested in? Hey, and you know what? The kids are our greatest resource as well. We sent out a survey to our students asking them, just that. Like, what sort of things do you want to learn about? Do you have any suggestions for online resources or platforms that you're familiar with and that you want us to check out? Because our students are very tech savvy. And I think that they can actually teach us a thing or two. So I think tapping into them, but really this idea of being able to personalize this learning experience for them and setting them up for, what sort of things do you want to study? Can you do an independent study? Can we do little lessons on finances and laws and home ownership, how to take care of your car, those sort of things. How can we still allow student voice and choice within the curriculum, whatever we're teaching here? I know one thing that we're working on is creating hyperdocs, which kind of is like an interactive assignment where kids, it could look like a bingo card. There's lots of different ways to structure it, but it gives them opportunities to work at their own pace. Links are embedded into the document so that they can click on links, watch videos, respond right on the document, and turn those sort of things in. So, we're playing around with different formats so that the kids can kind of work at their own pace or have like a menu option of different things that they can do for the units.
Janine, I love hyperlink docs.
Yes, they're great. Yeah, hyperdocs are awesome.
Is a hyperdoc a technical word for a document with hyperlinks on it?
Yeah, there's actually a
whole site.
There's a whole website.
Oh, gotcha.
There's templates that you can use, and then you can reformat them and whatever. But they are really a great way for online learning. It's easy for the teacher because you're kind of front loading everything. Once putting the hyperdoc together, it does take some time or whatever, but once you have that together, everything's kind of there for the students, and then they're able to work through it, clicking on these links and completing activities and that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that leads me to a really great point about what I think education should be in general, and that is equipping students to be self-determined learners. And I think that we've been robbing students of that opportunity in many educational settings in the past. We've said teachers are at the front of the room. Here are the things that the teachers think that you all should be learning. And this opportunity right now that we have in front of us is to upend that idea. And teachers can use things like personalization and hyperdocs in combination with one another to say, working with a student to personalize whatever it is that they're interested in, whatever it is that they care about, and whatever it is that they're going to really be motivated to learn more about. And then the teacher can use their expertise in finding resources and designing activities for students to go through that can be meaningful for them. I see so many schools that venture away from student agency. And I think this is the biggest opportunity for us to stop ignoring students as like able, capable human beings and not just sheep that we're sort of shepherding through school experiences.
Amen.
So the last segment of this podcast, after the first episode, we didn't really have a last segment, and I'm a big fan of, we have the things we want to talk about, and then we kind of wrap it up with some sort of last segment before we end the podcast officially. So for this episode, and hopefully we'll see how this goes for future episodes, I have come up with the idea to say the final segment is, how is this idea that we've been discussing helping us rethink what education should be? So, working with our title a little bit, kind of getting into what we're really hosting this podcast to explore. And I would love each one of us to talk for just, a little bit about if you were saying the COVID-19 pandemic is making us rethink one specific thing as it relates to distance learning, what would that be and why? And I'll kick it off. I think the top thing that it's making us rethink, in my view, is our relationship with seat time. And I said this for a little bit in our last episode, but I want to reemphasize it here, is that distance learning is exhausting. Sitting in the same seat all day long, Zoom conferencing, doing activities at your desk, like whatever you're doing is absolutely exhausting. And so, one of the ways our schools try to mitigate that is by decreasing the number of synchronous time minutes that we're actually engaging with students, and giving students Wednesdays to kind of regroup, redo whatever the things that they need to do, reach out to their teachers for extra help if necessary. But that makes me think, why are we not rethinking that for physical school? And, one of my colleagues today, he and I were talking about this, and he was like, well, one of the reasons why we're not rethinking that is because school acts as a daycare center for students when it's physically in session. Parents have to go to work. They can't be home with their kid one day a week or any days a week because they have to go to work. But
Right.
my pushback to that is, why do they have to go to work? Everybody or a lot of people are home right now, and potentially many people are doing work from home right now. So is it that this situation is causing us to rethink the time that we spend physically in a school building and potentially the time that we're spending at work in a typical work week? Maybe. I don't know. It's a big leap, but
Maybe.
what about for the rest of you all? What is this really, in your view, causing us to have to rethink?
For me, I really have an eye on the equity issue, just how that gap is even wider with distance learning, because of whether they lack resources or they lack support from family, whatever the situation might be. But I think that this distance learning situation with COVID-19 has just exasperated that.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about special education students,
Mm.
right? Which is
Yeah.
like another elephant in the room. We could talk about that for a while too. All right, Julie and Matt, what about you all?
Well, I think I already talked about how open source everything is becoming, but I think even like broadening that perspective to the physical space that we used to say, I'm going to school. It kind of makes me think that there's a lot of people rethinking what that physical space called the school is. And should we really have been pouring all of our money into those physical spaces when really we should be funding students? And
Interesting.
really the community is our classroom, right? So what will this look like as teachers rethink the possibilities if it doesn't take place within the four walls of a classroom? It takes place everywhere. So I think really opening that up and trying to reimagine what we call school is a great conversation to have as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's made me, I've been really appreciative, and we've talked about, all of these free tools that people have been offering, and I think it's great. But the tools are not enough, right? The tools aren't going to get it done. We need teachers to utilize those tools in effective ways to bring about learning. And we need teachers to know how to do that. So even if a teacher that's really good at directing student learning doesn't know how to utilize the tool or doesn't know how to utilize technology, the main goal isn't going to get across. And ultimately, the students won't be engaged because they're not going to be directed. So I think I've come to appreciate more the role and the power. I've always appreciated the power of the teacher for the learning, directing that, organizing that, facilitating that. But I just think, teachers, and we all do, we need continual growth and guidance on the world's changing. And this, pandemic is going to revolutionize the world in many ways, whether it be testing or how we interact with each other, or there's going to be huge changes that come as a result of this in the next, 3 to 6 months. And I think we as a education body need to be retrained in some of these technological skills and have an understanding of what we're supposed to do with it and how we can accomplish our goals rather than it being just another thing like a TV channel. You just hit play and it goes, but is that facilitating effective learning? That's been the main thing on my mind.
Dang, Matt, that's deep, man. That's a lot to think about. Well, hey, listen, it was great chatting with you all this evening. I really appreciated this conversation. I think we could talk for a while longer, but I want to leave listeners with some ideas of what's coming next. So we had our first episode, love in the life of the coronavirus, right? And we have our second episode here about distance learning. We're coming at you with our third episode in the series next, which is going to be all about teacher well-being. We're going to hopefully host a guest and bring the person on to give us some thoughts about how to encourage work-life balance for teachers, how to encourage really like wellness during the time of being stuck at home all day with your family and your dog, and you love those people and your animal, but it can be exhausting, and then you have to teach on top of that. We appreciate you listening. Please share our podcast with your friends. From the sunny side of Philadelphia, thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.